Hi, I'm going to talk to you about T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, and that's a good pairing. I know a lot about Eliot because I wrote my master's thesis on him. The topic was his criticism, that is, the criticism that he wrote, because he was the critical authority of the first half of the 20th century, though more and more challenged. And he was also a very famous and possibly a great poet. I think, in my opinion, time has not enough time has elapsed yet. And I was so absorbed. He was, in a way, a hero of mine, my hero. I'll tell you more about my exposure to him, and maybe this can influence someone who is listening. When I was an undergraduate, I became aware of him, and I was an English major, religion minor, and I didn't read him as an undergraduate, but I was aware of who and what he was. Now, anyone who reads his poetry realizes that his style is very allusive, A-L-L-U-S-I-V-E. That is, he freely, unabashedly, that is, not embarrassed apparently, unhesitatingly, alludes to, uses lines, words from a large number of foreign languages. Frankly, this inspired me to learn my languages. In a way, I patterned my whole education after Eliot, that is, or in an attempt to read and understand Eliot. In a way, that's true. In a way, that's true. And I pursued the people whom he was interested in, like Baudelaire, for example. Baudelaire was then, I think, maybe no longer, but was then considered the greatest French poet. Eliot spent a lot of time on Baudelaire, uses lines from Baudelaire in some of his poems. So I pursued Baudelaire. And then, okay, I literally patterned my life to some degree around Eliot. Now, I think I'll tell you a little about Eliot first, and then tell you a little more about me, and you'll see some things about both of us, but primarily Eliot. He was born in St. Louis. His father was a pretty wealthy businessman. Sent him to a private school. I don't remember anymore what private school. But then at 16 he matriculated to Harvard. That is, he attended Harvard, matriculate. Very young. Not only that, but it seems to me that maybe he got his undergraduate degree in 3 years. So that may not be true. I don't remember exactly. But then he stayed and became a graduate student studying philosophy. He was going to get a PhD in philosophy at Harvard. And there were some pretty, as always, remarkable people at Harvard then. George Santayana, who was basically a skeptic. Irving Babbitt, who was a famous scholar of French literature and French poetry. Various other people. While a graduate student, he also spent 2 years studying Sanskrit. Now, let's consider the range and I think maybe limitations of his knowledge. Okay, the 2 years he spent studying Sanskrit, he later referred to as a waste of time. I can't quite believe that, but maybe it's so. Now, his angle, he studied Sanskrit from the point of view of a philosopher, that is, becoming interested in Indian philosophy, the Upanishads, I'm sure, and Sankara, and these remarkable Indian religious philosophers. Then, no, his French, I think, his knowledge of French was not so good, because I know that Ezra Pound, his friend, senior, colleague in a way, later corrected his French in things he wrote. So obviously Pound's French was better. His knowledge of German, I think, was not very good either. His knowledge of Italian was not very good either. But he set his goal of reading Dante. He never lived in these... He lived in Germany briefly. He never lived in Italy and so forth, blah, blah, blah. But Sanskrit, wow. And, of course, he had a basic Latin and Greek classical education. His grandfather, by the way, had been president of Harvard, a famous man. His grandfather, Charles Eliot Norton, I think was his name. He was president of Harvard for about a long time, 30 years or something, I think. On both sides of his family, his antecedents were kind of impressive. Okay. So, then, as a graduate student at Harvard, he decided to go to England at almost the same time as Frost went. Robert Frost had gone in 1913, returned when the war began in 1914. Eliot went in 1916, when the war was on. Is that possible? I'm not sure of dates, but around there. Maybe he went in 1914. Let's say he went almost at the same time as Frost was returning. But he got stuck there. It was too dangerous to try to cross the Atlantic by that time, by the time he wanted to. Now, he spent 2 years at Oxford, I think. And he even knew personally Bertrand Russell. Wow, wow, wow. And they knew each other very well, apparently. Russell much older. So he was an impressive young guy, studying philosophy at Oxford, I guess, with Russell. But the war messed many people up, of course, and the studies came to an end. He was stuck in England, and so he found jobs, moved to London, and found jobs because basically he had decided he wanted to stay there. After the war, his family wanted him to return to the States, take his PhD at Harvard. I don't think he ever really completed the degree. He didn't complete the requirements. He did write his dissertation, but I think there were some various requirements that he didn't complete, though Harvard, happily enough, gave him an honorary PhD later, I'm sure. I'm quite sure of that. Complicated story. In London, he started to write poetry. He had started in 1914, maybe earlier in the States. But once again, I'm not sure. Yeah. His first poems were published on a small scale in 1917. This was J. Alfred Prufrock and other poems. Already he knew Pound, Ezra Pound. Now, Ezra Pound is a story unto himself, and I don't want to get sidetracked, but Pound was a more learned man than Eliot, had attended University of Pennsylvania, a gifted linguist, a really gifted linguist. He's my hero in some ways too, but his poetry is intolerable, I think. And gradually I'm going to tell you that I think Eliot's poetry is only barely tolerable. In the end, I don't think he is a great poet, and I'll tell you why. But gradually. Okay. With Pound's help, Pound was very helpful to him and very good to him. Pound, a strange, extraordinary case in literature. Eliot too, really. Background. First, Eliot, I was just talking to a student on film with Dr. Shin about America's fear of formality. And Eliot is a classical illustration of this. Every American has a problem with this. The American who chooses formality ceases to be an American. The American who chooses informality is so American, but really, frankly, in poetry especially, I think is aiming too low. Sorry, too low. Our informality is hard to achieve greatness in poetry. Hard. It's a problem. This fear of formality that is America. In our roots, and traditionally in the 19th and 18th and 17th centuries, we wanted to be European. After all, the old country with all its excellent cultural heritage, which we lacked, which we still lack, frankly, we looked to Europe for our culture. On the other hand, we want to be Americans, and we are proud, and justly so, I think, of our political achievements, our Constitution, which owes very little to the Europeans, and which is now respectable, and the world looks to us, not the Europeans, for a model, as a model for political, social, economic achievements. But culturally, we have problems. We don't have a problem. We don't have a culture that we can be very proud of. It's not very old, and what we have of it owes a lot to the Europeans. And where do the Europeans and British end and we begin? It's a huge, huge problem. And the American who, for example, learns languages and becomes learned in these things is learning, of course, is absorbing European culture, because none of this is American. How does one remain an American and absorb Greek, Latin, French, Italian, German, Spanish, European culture? It's a perennial problem. And I think, anyway, Eliot basically ceased to be an American. He wanted to become British. In fact, early in his writing, in his critical writings, because I know his prose writings well, having written my thesis on his prose writings, really he wanted to be a European. And in my own case, if it's of interest at all, I try to learn from Eliot's mistakes, because this becoming a European made him a pompous ass. A pompous ass. And for all his cute humor, for his nickname, Pound's nickname for him was Possum, or Old Possum, Possum. A possum is an animal who, like a hedgehog, kind of play acts, feigns being dead, or pretends to be something else to avoid predators. So Pound's nickname for him for the 50 years of their friendship, on and off, was Possum. Because he's very ironic. His lines conceal a lot of hidden allusions, inside jokes, which critics spent decades finding, and I followed them somewhat. I taught a college course on Eliot and Pound many years ago. So I'm really part of this drama. What's good about his poetry? Okay, first of all, the major poems. The first important poem is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The best thing about it, very elusive, contains lines or words at least in French, Italian, German, Sanskrit, German maybe not, but the second and first major poem is The Wasteland, and it contains, it's only 420 lines, but it contains German, French, Italian, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, lines or at least words. Prufrock, a little less, is the earlier poem. The Wasteland dates from 1922, was completed in 1921. Now it is very interesting, and here's why. Eliot wrote this poem. He had been very depressed, and sent it to Pound, who at that time was in France, I think, asking Pound to edit it. The poem, I have a volume right here, I'll show you. Very interesting. Eliot's widow published this, I think, Valerie Eliot. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Facsimile, that is, photocopy and transcript of the original drafts, including the annotations of Ezra Pound. He sent a poem, I think, of about 2,000 lines to Pound. Pound sent back 420. Rightly speaking, justly speaking, the poem is a collaboration of these two guys. Because the poem which Eliot sent to Pound and the poem which was published are two very different things. Now, I have never read or studied this book. It's utterly innocent of my, and I never will, and I never care to. But isn't that, it must be the most interesting example of collaboration, literary collaboration in all of literature. Now, Pound with the same more learning than Eliot. Eliot respected Pound and looked up to him as his superior. In fact, he dedicated, this is typical, he dedicated The Wasteland to Ezra Pound, Il miglior fabbro. Il miglior fabbro these are three Italian words from Dante. Dante in his Purgatory, comes to a place where poets, he talks with a couple of poets. They are on the final ledge of Purgatory before entering the earthly paradise. And their punishment there is burning. And these interesting poets, whom Dante knew of, or in some cases knew, talked to Dante, and Dante refers to one of them as il miglior fabbro, the better maker, his superior. Il miglior can be the best. It's ambiguous in Italian. I think Eliot means the better. I think Dante does too. Anyway, so a kind tribute, of course, in a foreign language, in Dante, because Dante, if Eliot had two heroes, Shakespeare and Dante. And for me, they became two of my heroes too, though I've added some. Eliot had some more minor heroes too, and I'll tell you about them if we get a chance. Okay. Eliot actually published very little in his lifetime. He would take years to make and publish a work. Meanwhile, he had to make a living. And early, he was a banker for 7 years or 8 years in Lloyd's Bank in London. Wow, a banker? Wow. But he had to make a living. He also got married early, I'm not sure what year, let's say 1921, but the marriage didn't work at all. This was the first marriage. She was very unbalanced. Russell knew her too, knew them both. Bertrand Russell, Lord Russell, great man, I think. And soon, I think she had to be committed to a psychiatric hospital where she spent the rest of her life, I think, and maybe, I guess they were divorced, or maybe she just died. Doesn't matter. Sexual distress is a big part of Eliot's poetry. Sexual distress and impotence. But these become metaphors a little bit for wider cultural themes. His ultimate theme became gradually the quest for God. Now, a little more background. When he stopped, while he was still working for Lloyd's, he also started writing critical essays. And he built up a huge authority as a literary critic. Everybody, people on both sides of the Atlantic, wanted to read Eliot's opinions in these critical essays. His prose is very good. in the end, I think his prose is probably better than his poetry. I wonder if my colleagues and masters in the States would agree with this nowadays. I think Eliot has become a kind of minor poet, I suspect. Now, he won the Nobel Prize, of course, 1948 or 50, around there. Partly as a poet and partly as a critic. His authority, again, was great. And the poet and the critic kind of fed off each other, so that his authority in both was huge. It was almost a joke among more learned people than Eliot. Now, at the same time, Eliot was desperately, the wasteland is a statement to this, desperately looking for religious faith. Finally, he made the move in 1927, a big year for him, when he became officially an Anglican. He called himself an Anglo-Catholic, I'll explain that too. And he also became a British citizen, same year. So he committed himself to England. He was an Englishman. So I wasn't exaggerating before when I said he ceased to be an American. That's what he set out to do. To cease to be an American, to become a European. That was his goal. Ashamed to be an American? A little. But proud of his family. But the ties with the family became more and more tenuous, thinner and thinner. Now, his manner, both as a poet and as a critic, was, let's say, aggressively Anglican. And I said I would explain this Anglo-Catholic thing. This, too, had a huge influence on me. It was for me. And I became kind of an Anglo-Catholic. And I remember painfully now arguing in classes to my students, basically bludgeoning, like with a hammer, bludgeoning my students with my aggressive Anglo-Catholicism. So I learned a lot about it. By the way, Auden too, about whom I must speak, but I'll speak less. Anglo-Catholic too. C.S. Eliot, many of you, C.S. Lewis, excuse me, many of you know him from children's books even, famous short books like the Screwtape Letters, books about religion, Anglo-Catholic. Their hero was a man named Charles Williams. He was the hero of all these guys, including Auden. Eliot's hero was Charles Williams. C.S. Lewis's hero was Charles Williams. Strange man. Charles Williams was kind of a librarian, worked for a publishing house too, and a religious thinker, and he formed a kind of group who would meet from time to time, pray, talk about religion, Protestant style all the way. Now, why Anglo-Catholic? Because this is the point. An Anglo-Catholic is a conservative Anglican. The Church of England, like any church, like any group, has its its divisions, its factions. Within the Church of England, Anglo-Catholics are conservatives in the sense that they are very fond of Rome. They're very fond of the Roman tradition, of the Catholic tradition. But of course they're Anglicans because they don't like the authority so much of the Vatican. And I felt this, I still feel it. And I became a Catholic for a while later in my life, but couldn't stand it. That's a big problem, especially for an American. I used to teach that there's no such thing as an American Catholic. Why? Because the principles are so contrary, so conflicting. An American who believes in the value of individualism, egalitarianism, all equal, and Rome with its authoritarianism, its heavy-handed authoritarianism, its heavy-handed hierarchy. The Roman Church is nothing but authority. How can an American be a Catholic? I still don't believe it. These Hispanics who now are so numerous in our country, some of them, I suppose, manage it, but only by not thinking about it. An American really cannot be a Catholic. I don't believe it. The principle of authority is so great. Back to Anglo-Catholic. So, Eliot, C.S. Lewis, these are big names. Auden, my God, and some other less famous guys were Anglo-Catholics. Conservative, loving the Roman past, the glories of the Roman Catholic Church, loving its abstract thought. Maybe. Are they Aristotelians? I doubt it. And the Church heavily Aristotle, Aristotelian, Aquinas, readers of Aquinas? I doubt it. I don't believe it. Eliot, as a student of philosophy, knew his Aristotle, but he was no Aristotelian, I think. Anyway, what did it really mean? I would say what it really meant is loving Dante. An Anglo-Catholic is an Anglo-Catholic because he or she loves Dante. That's it. There it is. Exactly. No other reason. An Anglo-Catholic is an Anglican who loves Dante. Dante's structure, the beauty of Dante's poem, the Divine Comedy, the greatness, the sublimity of Dante's poem is so great that really it's kind of hard not to fall under its influence. So why not become a Catholic? Well, in a way it could be said that Dante wasn't entirely Catholic. Dante disliked a lot about Rome and the Vatican, after all. Disliked all the corruption, and even calls the authority, the authority of the Vatican into question many times. I'll talk about that some other time. So, there it is. I've never thought of it that way, but that's exactly it. An Anglo-Catholic is an Anglo-Catholic because he or she loves Dante. That's a profound observation. Sociologically, religiously, no. Back to our story. First main poem then, important poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, 1917. But it was only 90 lines long, so major poem, no. Other poems in the early works followed, form. Eliot's poetry, all of his famous poetry is written in free verse. Free verse means no regular pattern. An early poem like Prufrock has some rhyme, in fact a lot of rhyme, but no regular pattern. The length of lines vary greatly. The rhyme patterns are not regular. But he also wrote at this time many regular poems, quatrain poems. A quatrain is a stanza consisting of 4 lines. And these quatrain poems had rhyme, conservative. In the early 20th century, conservative. Now, The Wasteland and other poems, all of those poems, maybe most of them anyway, are free verse. And The Wasteland most aggressively free verse. So, after that, the next important poem, 1927, that fateful year for him when he committed himself to the Church of England and became a citizen of England, he also wrote and published Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is a poem of religious distress. And in his prose writing during the 20s, by the way, I'll tell you a little bit about that. The prose writings. My master's thesis, the title is Wit, Orthodoxy, and Wisdom in the Criticism of T.S. Eliot. And typically, it's a cliche almost, I divided Eliot's career as a critic into 3 periods. The early period when he loved wit. This is when his other major love, because Dante gradually gained ascendancy with him. But his early heroes were John Donne, D-O-N-N-E, and the so-called metaphysical poets, who, many of them, Donne especially, were very witty. Andrew Marvell, witty guys, wonderful wits, the wittiest, well, very witty. Eliot loved them, and in his critical writings wrote important essays in which he called attention to them, and because his authority was so great, suddenly everybody was reading them. Everybody was reading the metaphysical poets. Then he evolved toward orthodoxy. This is the period when he became an Anglican, an Anglo-Catholic, of course. And his word, again and again, orthodoxy. One must be orthodox. And by orthodox, of course, he meant Anglo-Catholic. Well, this is hard to take. I mean, at the time, I kind of admired, at the time in my life, I kind of admired him for it, but in retrospect, what a pompous ass. What a pompous ass. I speak as an American, because I guess I'm a little more American than he is. And I think I'm as European as he was too. But doesn't matter. Anyway, he went through this period of orthodoxy, his most obnoxious period. His early period is obnoxious enough. His middle period is very obnoxious. He also wrote a couple of books in which he defended orthodoxy. Embarrassing. I think it was embarrassing to him himself later, because the third period I called wisdom. In this during this period, as an older man, obviously, he strove for wisdom, and maybe sometimes he achieved a kind of wisdom. Certainly, he could laugh at his own pomposity, his own arrogance of before. He acquired humility, and he talked about it in his essays. And most important for me, and my thesis is the best thing I have ever written in prose to date, anyway. I tried to get it published. It was praised, but problems publishing it. My professors urged me to try to get it published. Didn't work, and I gave up, and I'm glad. It was not worth my time. But the third period, what's wise about it? Well, what I found in reading all of his prose, because I read it all in his criticism, what I found was that he consciously tried to return to re-examine some of the authors whom he had condemned earlier. Goethe, most notably. Goethe, the prince of German poetry and the German literary past, kind of. Eliot had been very critical and negative about Goethe earlier. He returns, high praise. I don't remember too many of the others, but he did this again and again. Dickens. Again and again he tried to reassess these people whom, for one reason or another, he had condemned or just excoriated, E-X-C, and tried to be more moderate and say nice things about them. This was part of his self-conscious attempt to acquire some humility and wisdom. Meanwhile, he remarried after many years. By then he was probably 50 when he remarried. By the way, he was born in 1888. He died in 1965, I think. So he lived, 88, 65, and 12 is 77. Relatively long. I think he remarried maybe when he was 50. But he found peace in this remarriage to Valerie Eliot, who, after all, was his secretary, I think. So that suggests a stripping of some of his pomposity and his elitism, I suppose. I still admire his elitism in many ways, but his manner was all wrong. And it's amazing to me that the British, of all people, revered him. I guess they revered him because he outbridded the Brits. He outbridded the Brits, if you understand my meaning. He was more British than the British. He was more British than Russell. Amusing. Okay, so that's the evolution of his critical theory. I see today I'm only going to talk about Eliot, if that's okay, Dr. Shin, because I still have a lot to say. Now, his third, okay, once again I'm going to repeat myself. Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, published 1917. The Wasteland, which many still consider his greatest work, 1922. Ash Wednesday, not in the same class, but showing a change, this spirituality, full of guilt, full of self-flagellation, to whip, self-flagellation. And then, his crowning work, he thought, and maybe it is called The Four Quartets. By the way, I must mention to you also his dramas, his poetic dramas, which deserve credit, though great hardly, I think. The Four Quartets, what happened? Well, they were published over an 8-year period. The first one, Burnt Norton, I think, was published maybe in 1935. The next one, maybe 1939, East Coker. The third one, what's the third one? I don't remember. And the fourth one, and most important, Little Gidding, in 1945. Now, Little Gidding says a lot about it, but I better explain. The Wasteland is divided into 5 sections. It's only 420 lines long, 5 sections. An earlier poem had been divided into 5 sections too. Now, Ash Wednesday may be divided into 5 sections, but the 4 quartets, each of them is divided into 5 sections. You see a pattern here, an attempt to gain some continuity, an attempt to make cross references to earlier works, an attempt to gain some coherence of life, of literary coherence, and of his life too. And I think admirable, remarkable. So each of the 4 quartets has these same 5 divisions. Different things happen, but and I've never really studied them so that I can talk of them with authority. They're very difficult, and the critics who write about them and analyze them discover remarkable things. I would say the 4 quartets, regarded as a single work, is the best thing he did, and the best part of that is the 4th one, Little Gidding. Now, what's Little Gidding? What strange titles, anyway. Burnt Norton, blah, blah, blah. East Coker, one of them refers to some place in Massachusetts where his family used to spend summers. Cape Cod, I'm sure. But Little Gidding is the name of a small religious community where Charles Williams would kind of hold court. An Anglican small place, community, religious community. Some lived there, but Eliot went there many times as a religious retreat. And I'm sure, I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure Charles Williams was the guiding light of that whole community. And there it is, that's the title of the 4th 4 quartet, and probably the best thing he ever did. Most moving, I think, because in that work he deals with the struggle of England during World War II. The endless bombings, because London was bombed incessantly for a couple of years. And Eliot, it all made Eliot feel British at last. He was he worked in the bomb shelters. By this time he's almost 60, 57. And he talked about the dark birds, dark blah 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 blah, the bombs coming in, the V-2 rockets coming in, the constant fear, the horror of sustained bombing. And this makes Little Gidding a much more serious and moving poem. In Little Gidding, he also refers to some compound ghost who talks with him. And the ghost is kind of a composite figure of these heroes of the past. Dante, maybe Eliot, I don't know, I don't... Shakespeare, Dante and Shakespeare especially. And he talks with them, with the ghost, and the ghost makes fun of him a little bit, and they analyze language a little bit, which is a part that's important to me. The point being, really I think his point is a remarkable point. So to speak, it's not possible to say anything that has meaning. That's kind of an implied conclusion of the logical positivists and the analytical philosophers of the first half of the century. Without studying them entirely, I think it may be true. But his point is the meanings of individual words are, first of all, not very clear, are very arbitrary. We say pen and it refers to this, but that gets into philosophical problems. But let's deal with emotions. Let's just deal with an emotion like love. What do we mean when we say love? God knows. It means so many things. And I think most of the time we have no idea what we mean by it, even when we address it to a person whom we presumably love. At best, it has a very nebulous, very approximate meaning. The same is true, of course, for any emotion. We have given names to emotions. How many? How many emotions have we given names to? 50? How many emotions does a human being feel? Well, I would suspect maybe thousands. So we have 50 names, each of them very approximate, each of them very crude, each of them having a shifting meaning all the time. As much as we might want to analyze any thought, any feeling, anything we want to say, I think as soon as we analyze it, it crumbles and disappears and vanishes. Well, Eliot kind of gets into this. His meaning is more, by the time we figure out how to say anything that we've felt, the feeling has vanished, we no longer feel it, it's no longer too important to say anyway, it's kind of a distant memory, it's so to speak a fossil. Eliot doesn't get into this too much, but he gets into it some. After all, he knew Russell and the analytical philosophers, and he was a philosopher himself. And in the end, he's quite a philosophical poet. Now, I'll teach you a word. Pontificate. To pontificate. This comes from the word pontiff, and the pontiff is the pope. And when we say that someone is pontificating, and I'm sure I pontificate very often, teachers tend to, we, so to speak with the authority of the Pope from on high, from the throne of the Pope, wearing our absurd robes and our absurd hat and are surrounded by our absurd pomp and splendor. I say absurd as a true American, but I think it is absurd. My God, it is absurd. The trappings and the surroundings of popes and the authority with which they speak is absurd. Sorry. They have no business speaking the way they do. But then no one has any business speaking about anything as if it were a certitude, because that too is absurd, in my opinion. Okay, now back to Eliot. Sorry. I said I would talk about his plays. Now, Eliot made a brave attempt to revive poetic drama. Shakespeare. Our beloved Elizabethans and Jacobeans, the golden age of the English stage, was at a time when plays were written in blank verse. That is, iambic pentameter, lines 10 beats per line, or some regular form. Eliot wrote 5 or 6 poetic dramas. The best, I've never studied them. The best one, I'm told, is Murder in the Cathedral, and I believe it. Heavily influenced by a French play by Jean Anouilh, I think, A-N, not E-N-N, Anouilh, A-N-O-U-I-H-L, very strange name. But this is a great, great story. It's the story of Henry II, King of England, and Thomas à Becket, Saint Thomas à Becket, who was murdered as Archbishop in Canterbury, in the Canterbury Cathedral. Well, what a great story. It became later, the only version I know well, a great, great movie, film. There is none better in the English language, called Becket, starring Richard Burton, who is one of the best actors we've ever seen, British, and Peter O'Toole, wonderful Peter O'Toole. It's a film version of the French play and of Eliot's play, and I don't know how closely it resembles, but generally it resembles. What a wonderful story. If you get a chance and want to see one of the best films ever made, see it. Becket. B-E-C-K-E-T. Probably about 1958, maybe, so a while back. So Eliot wrote and produced. They appeared on the stage, and some with success. Murder in the Cathedral was a popular and financial success. Family Reunion. I can't even name the others. Some are comedies of manners. That means basically he tried to be like George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. Well, that's going to be the most intolerable Eliot. That's the Eliot who's trying to be like Henry James. Henry James, by the way, is a perfect example of our American problem too. The impossibility of being the near impossibility of being a cultured American, because these two are a little bit contradictory. Cultured means European culture, period. There is no American culture, unless one wants to assume that we go out to the plains and study the American Indians, the Navajos, and all that. Come on. What is American culture? American culture, I'm afraid, is American popular culture. We have produced some literature. We have produced some artists. Short stories, some poetry. Now, Emily Dickinson, she solved the problem. She's my favorite example of a person who solved the problem. She is thoroughly American, but the equal of the Europeans for intellect, for insight, but thoroughly American. She solved the problem. There are some other isolated cases. Catcher in the Rye solves the problem. The Great Gatsby a little bit solves the problem, but it's not often, and it's hard to do. And I think when a person does it, it's by luck. Anyway, so Eliot became so famous. His authority started to wane when thinking people read his aggressive orthodoxy and said, "What? Do you really expect me to swallow this? You with your pontificate? Please, be serious. You can't expect me to take this seriously." By the way, he ran into a little problem with anti-Semitism. Pound got into a lot of problems with anti-Semitism. That is, after World War II, when the horrors of Auschwitz, the mass murders, the horrors of the Nazi regime were revealed, the excess, the terrible things that they had done, okay, the Nazis had done. During the 30s, Pound was a fascist. He considered, well, he was Italian. He lived for many years in Italy. I knew his grandson, visited their home. I knew his daughter, who was the grandson's mother, that as I met and talked with and visited them at their home 2 or 3 times, I guess, in northern Italy. Pound was a fascist, that is, Mussolini. The fascists were not aggressively anti-Semitic. It's not in the Italians. But the fascists teamed up with Hitler, and the fascists, part of the deal that Mussolini and Hitler made was a cooperation. That is, the Nazis, the fascists, Mussolini, and the fascisti, cooperated by turning over to the Nazis, capturing and turning over many Jews. Thousands, I don't know how many. I imagine at least a couple of thousand. Well, this is terrible. And Eliot was kind of a crypto-fascist in the 30s. During the 30s, crypto, hidden, backdoor. We have to remember that the 30s were a difficult time. It was the time of the Great Depression in America, and that Great Depression was felt everywhere. During the 30s, it was almost true that one either had to become a fascist or a socialist. There were these two options. Democracy seemed untenable. Democracy, capitalistic democracy, seemed to have failed. And so thinking people either became socialists, like George Orwell, or fascists. That is, a fascist really thinks, both of them think that democracy has failed. A socialist is a dreamer who hopes that everyone can share power and possessions and wealth and all that. A fascist is a hardcore realist who thinks we need the man with the iron fist. We need a person who says do this and it's done. Not a democracy that says let's do this. Well, let's talk about it. Well, I'm not sure we can do this. A time of great impatience with democracy was the 30s, and Eliot was swept, like a good Anglo-Catholic that he was, toward the conservative side, and the conservative side was fascist. And Pound was totally with conviction there. This was an embarrassment later. And Pound was captured by the Americans in northern Italy. He had made dangerous statements on radio to the American troops. He was captured, put under arrest, and he was tried for treason. He was not found guilty because he was found insane. Pound wasn't insane. That was a generous finding. But Pound spent 12 years, I'm talking about Pound now, that's some later time. But Eliot, because of his association with Pound and other conservatives, sort of acquired an anti-Semitic, a reputation for anti-Semitic sentiments. And this got him in trouble later, though not political trouble. It's not a crime. It's not a crime to be anti-Semitic, after all. Anyway, should I give you a couple of questions? A couple of questions. What is an Anglo-Catholic? Now, I realize I'm talking to people who may or may not be nominally Christians. This will force you to get into the questions of the denominations of Protestantism, into history, the Church of England, things like that. How did it come about? Kind of embarrassing. Anyway, what is an Anglo-Catholic? Second, hard. What do I mean by the problem of being a cultured American?